I'm going to tell you something that will sound impossible, something that has shattered my understanding of reality and left me questioning the very nature of human consciousness. For the past 6 months, every single night at exactly 3:33 a.m., I wake up in someone else's body. Not metaphorically, not in a dream. I mean, I literally open my eyes and I'm looking through someone else's face, feeling their heartbeat in their chest, experiencing their memories flooding through their mind like they're my own. And the most terrifying part, it's getting worse every single night, and I'm starting to realize that whatever is happening to me isn't random at all. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar, because what I'm about to share with you might be happening to more people than we realize. My name is David, I'm 28 years old, and until 6 months ago, I lived a completely normal life in Portland, Oregon. I worked as a software developer, had a small apartment downtown, and the strangest thing that ever happened to me was occasionally having vivid dreams that I could remember for more than 5 minutes after waking up. I was the kind of person who watched horror movies and laughed at the supernatural elements, convinced that ghosts and demons were just products of overactive imaginations and cultural superstitions. But everything changed on March 15th of this year. I remember that date exactly because it was the night my entire worldview collapsed. I had gone to bed around 11 p.m. after a typical day of work and Netflix. Nothing unusual about my routine or my state of mind. I wasn't stressed, wasn't taking any medications, hadn't been drinking or experimenting with anything that could explain what happened next. I fell asleep easily and slept deeply until I was suddenly jolted awake by the most intense sensation I had ever experienced. When my eyes opened, I wasn't in my bedroom. I was staring at a cracked ceiling in what appeared to be a rundown motel room, the smell of cigarette smoke and mildew filling my nostrils. But that wasn't even the strangest part. When I tried to sit up, I realized immediately that something was fundamentally wrong with my body. My hands weren't my hands. They were smaller, more delicate, with chipped purple nail polish that I had never worn. When I looked down, I was wearing a faded pink nightgown that definitely wasn't mine, and my hair was falling in dark waves around shoulders that felt completely foreign. Hit the like button if this story is already giving you chills, because it only gets more terrifying from here. The panic that set in was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I stumbled to a grimy bathroom mirror and found myself staring at the face of a woman I had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with tired brown eyes and worry lines that suggested a life filled with stress and hardship. But here's what made it absolutely clear that this wasn't just some incredibly vivid dream. I could access her memories. Not all of them, but fragments were floating through my consciousness like puzzle pieces. Her name was Sarah. She lived in a motel in Bakersfield, California, and she was hiding from someone who had been threatening her for weeks. The most disturbing part was that I could feel her emotions as if they were my own. The constant fear she lived with, the exhaustion from looking over her shoulder everywhere she went, the desperation of having nowhere safe to turn. But underneath all of that familiar human terror was something else, something that made my blood run cold even while inhabiting her body. Sarah was experiencing supernatural encounters of her own. In the corners of her memories, I could see shadowy figures that moved when they shouldn't, hear whispers in empty rooms, feel the presence of something malevolent that seemed to be growing stronger every night. I tried to speak, to call out, to do anything that might wake me up from what I was convinced had to be the most realistic nightmare of my life. But when I opened my mouth, Sarah's voice came out. Not mine. The sound was higher, softer, tinged with an accent that belonged to someone who had grown up in the rural South. I could even taste the lingering flavor of menthol cigarettes on her tongue, something I had never smoked in my life. Every sensation was perfectly real, perfectly detailed, perfectly impossible. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because what I discovered next makes this story even more disturbing. As I stood in that motel bathroom, staring at Sarah's reflection and trying to process the impossibility of my situation, I noticed something that made my heart stop. On the nightstand next to the bed was a digital clock displaying the time in bright red numbers, 3:33 a.m. The exact same time, down to the minute, that I had been waking up from deep sleep for the past several weeks without understanding why. You see, for about a month before this first body-swapping experience, I had been experiencing what I thought were simple sleep disturbances. Every single night, I would wake up at precisely 3:33 a.m. for no apparent reason. I would lie there for a few minutes, feeling strangely alert and unsettled, then eventually fall back asleep. I had attributed it to stress from work or maybe too much caffeine, but now I was beginning to understand that those wake-ups had been preparing me for something much more sinister. The experience in Sarah's body lasted exactly until 4 a.m. I know this because I watched the clock obsessively, terrified of what might happen next but unable to do anything except exist as a passenger in someone else's life. At 4 a.m. on the dot, I felt a sudden pulling sensation, like being yanked backward through a dark tunnel, and then I was gasping awake in my own bed in Portland, staring at my familiar ceiling, covered in cold sweat and shaking uncontrollably. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories like this one, because this was only the beginning of my nightmare. For the rest of that day, I convinced myself it had been an incredibly vivid dream, brought on by stress or something I had eaten. I even looked up sleep disorders and lucid dreaming, trying to find some rational explanation for what I had experienced. But deep down, I knew that what I had felt was too real, too detailed, too emotionally complex to be just a dream. Sarah's memories were still lingering in my mind like echoes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in California, there was a terrified woman who had no idea that someone else had been looking through her eyes. The second night, I tried everything I could think of to prevent it from happening again. I stayed up until 4 a.m., thinking that if I was already awake at 3:33, whatever was causing this couldn't take hold. But exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I dozed off around 4:30 in the morning. When I woke up a few hours later, I felt like I had dodged whatever supernatural bullet had been aimed at me. I went through my normal day feeling relieved and almost proud of myself for outsmarting whatever force had invaded my sleep. But that relief was short-lived. The following night, despite my best efforts to stay awake, I fell asleep around 2 a.m. and found myself jolting awake at exactly 3:33 in the body of a 70-year-old man named Frank, who lived alone in a cluttered house in Detroit. Frank's arthritis ached in joints I didn't even know I had. His weak eyes struggled to focus on the shapes moving in the shadows of his bedroom, and his memories revealed decades of supernatural encounters that had left him convinced his house was haunted by something that fed on loneliness and despair. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because what I discovered about the connection between all these people will absolutely terrify you. Each person whose body I inhabit isn't just random. They're all experiencing their own paranormal activity, and something is using me to collect their fear, their memories, their spiritual energy for a purpose that I'm only beginning to understand. And the worst part? After 6 months of this nightly torment, I think whatever is doing this to me is getting stronger, and I'm starting to lose pieces of myself every time I return to my own body. Paragraph 2, 2,000 words. The pattern became undeniably clear after the first 2 weeks of this supernatural nightmare. Every single night at 3:33 a.m., I would be ripped from my own consciousness and thrust into the body of someone else, somewhere else in America. And without exception, each person was dealing with their own terrifying paranormal encounters. It wasn't just coincidence. Something was specifically targeting people who were already vulnerable to supernatural forces, and it was using me as some kind of spiritual conduit to access them. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you might help explain encounters that others have dismissed as imagination or mental illness. The third person I inhabited was a 19-year-old college student named Emma, who lived in a dorm at Ohio State University. Through her eyes, I watched as her roommate's belongings moved by themselves in the middle of the night, arranged into symbols that neither of us recognized, but that filled us both with an inexplicable sense of dread. Emma's memories revealed weeks of escalating activity, voices calling her name from empty hallways, her reflection appearing wrong in mirrors, showing expressions she wasn't making, and text messages appearing on her phone from numbers that didn't exist, containing threats written in languages she didn't recognize. But what made Emma's situation particularly disturbing was that she could sense my presence inside her consciousness. While I was experiencing her life through her senses, she was somehow aware that someone else was sharing her mental space. I could feel her confusion and terror intensifying as she realized that the paranormal activity in her life had expanded to include some kind of spiritual possession or consciousness invasion. Through her perspective, I watched her grab a notebook and frantically write, "Someone else is in my head. I can feel you watching through my eyes. What do you want from me?" The experience was terrifying for both of us, but it also revealed something crucial about what was happening to me. This wasn't just some random supernatural phenomenon. It was deliberate, targeted, and interactive. Whatever force was causing me to jump between bodies was also making the people I inhabited aware of my presence, amplifying their fear and paranormal experiences in the process. It was like I was being used as a supernatural virus, infecting people who were already spiritually vulnerable and making their situations exponentially worse. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because the fourth night brought me into the body of Marcus, a 35-year-old truck driver who was parked at a rest stop in Nevada. Marcus had been experiencing what he thought were hallucinations brought on by too many caffeine pills and not enough sleep, but through his memories, I could see that his semi-truck had become a mobile haunted location. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible places. His CB radio would pick up conversations from decades past, and shadows in his rearview mirror moved independently of any light source. What made Marcus's situation unique was that his paranormal encounters seemed to be tied to specific locations along his regular route. Every time he drove through certain stretches of highway, particularly in areas where fatal accidents had occurred, the supernatural activity would intensify. His logbook, which I could access through his memories, documented dozens of encounters with apparitions, unexplained mechanical failures that corrected themselves, and sightings of vehicles that appeared in his mirrors but weren't there when he turned around. But the most chilling discovery was that Marcus had been keeping track of a pattern he noticed in his supernatural encounters. They had all intensified dramatically over the past month, coinciding exactly with when I had started experiencing my nightly body-swapping episodes. Through his perspective, I realized that my presence in these people's lives wasn't just observational. I was somehow catalyzing and amplifying paranormal activity that was already present but dormant. The fifth person I inhabited was Rebecca, a 42-year-old single mother in Savannah, Georgia, whose historic house had become increasingly active with supernatural entities. Through her body, I experienced the terror of living in a home where doors opened and closed on their own, where children's laughter echoed from empty rooms, and where the temperature would drop by 30 degrees in localized areas without any explanation. Rebecca's memories showed me months of escalating activity, furniture rearranging itself overnight, photographs of her deceased parents appearing and disappearing from frames, and most disturbing of all, her 8-year-old daughter having conversations with invisible friends who knew details about the family's private life that no one should have known. Comment below what you think is connecting all these people, because the answer is more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. During my time in Rebecca's body, I discovered that she had been researching her house's history and had uncovered a disturbing pattern. The previous 5 families who had lived there had all experienced similar supernatural activity, and in each case, the activity had intensified dramatically just before the family either moved away or, in 2 cases, suffered unexplained tragedies that forced them to leave. What connected all these people, Sarah, Frank, Emma, Marcus, Rebecca, and the dozens of others whose bodies I would inhabit over the following months, was that they were all experiencing supernatural encounters that followed the same escalating pattern. It would start with minor disturbances that could be explained away as imagination or coincidence. Then the activity would intensify gradually, becoming more frequent and more obviously paranormal. Finally, it would reach a crescendo of terrifying encounters that would either drive the person away from their location or, in some cases, result in serious psychological or physical harm. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. I began to realize that my nightly visits to these people weren't random at all. Something was systematically identifying individuals who were already experiencing paranormal activity and then using me to harvest their fear, their spiritual energy, and their increasingly intense supernatural encounters. Each time I inhabited someone's body, their paranormal situation would escalate dramatically, as if my presence was feeding whatever entities were already attached to them. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar, because by the 6th week of this nightmare, I had inhabited the bodies of nearly 40 different people across the United States, and every single one of them was dealing with supernatural encounters that intensified dramatically during my visit. I was becoming a supernatural catalyst, amplifying paranormal activity wherever I was sent, and I could feel something growing stronger with each encounter. The most terrifying realization came when I started keeping detailed notes about each person I inhabited. I recorded their names, locations, the types of paranormal activity they were experiencing, and any patterns I could identify. What I discovered was that the supernatural entities affecting these people weren't random ghosts or demons. They were all connected to something larger, something that was systematically targeting people who were spiritually sensitive or emotionally vulnerable. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what I uncovered next revealed the true purpose behind my nightly torment. Each person I inhabited was being prepared for something. The escalating paranormal activity wasn't random harassment, it was conditioning. Something was gradually breaking down their psychological and spiritual defenses, making them more susceptible to possession, manipulation, or worse. And I was being used as the delivery mechanism, the spiritual equivalent of a Trojan horse that could bypass their natural protective barriers and accelerate the process. By the 2-month mark, I had stopped trying to find rational explanations for what was happening to me. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I was being used by some kind of supernatural intelligence to locate and corrupt people who were already dealing with paranormal encounters. Each visit would leave them more vulnerable, more terrified, and more isolated from normal reality. It was like I was part of a spiritual harvesting operation, and the people I inhabited were being prepared for something that I didn't yet understand, but that filled me with absolute dread. The worst part was that I could feel myself changing with each encounter. Every time I returned to my own body at 4 a.m., I brought back fragments of the fear, despair, and supernatural contamination that I had experienced. My own apartment began showing signs of paranormal activity, shadows moving in my peripheral vision, electronics malfunctioning in patterns that seemed almost communicative, and a constant feeling of being watched by something that remained just beyond my ability to perceive directly. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because as you'll discover in the next part of my nightmare, the entities behind my body-swapping experiences had plans for me that went far beyond simply using me as a spiritual courier. They were grooming me for something specific, something that would require me to voluntarily surrender my consciousness permanently. And they were willing to torment dozens of innocent people to break down my resistance and prepare me for whatever horrifying fate they had in mind. Paragraph 3, 2,000 words. 3 months into this supernatural nightmare, the truth behind my nightly body-swapping experiences began to reveal itself in ways that shattered my sanity and left me questioning whether I would survive with my soul intact. The entities responsible weren't just randomly tormenting people. They were conducting what I can only describe as a spiritual harvesting operation, and I was their primary collection agent. But more terrifying than that realization was the discovery that everything they had put me through was preparation for a final, permanent transfer that would leave me trapped forever, while something else took control of my body. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the evidence I gathered during those 3 months painted a picture of supernatural predation that operates on a scale most people couldn't imagine. I had begun keeping detailed records not just of the people I inhabited, but of what happened to them after my visits. Through social media stalking, local news searches, and even hiring a private investigator, I tracked down as many of my involuntary hosts as possible to learn about the long-term effects of my supernatural visits. What I discovered was absolutely horrifying. Sarah, the woman hiding in the Bakersfield motel who had been my first experience, had disappeared 3 days after my visit. The motel manager told police that she had checked out in the middle of the night, leaving behind all her belongings and acting like she was in some kind of trance. Security footage showed her walking out to the parking lot at exactly 3:33 a.m. and getting into a car that wasn't registered to anyone, driven by a figure whose face couldn't be made out despite the clarity of the video. She hasn't been seen since. Frank, the elderly man from Detroit whose house was haunted, had been found by neighbors after 3 days of not picking up his mail. When they used their spare key to check on him, they discovered that he had barricaded himself in his basement, surrounded by salt circles and religious symbols, claiming that the collector was coming for him and that he could hear it moving through the walls. He was committed to a psychiatric facility where he remains today, constantly drawing symbols that match no known language, but that made me physically ill to look at when I found photos of them online. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because Emma's fate was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The college student who had sensed my presence in her consciousness had become convinced that she was sharing her body with a demon. According to her roommate, Emma had started speaking in multiple voices, claiming that different entities were taking turns controlling her thoughts and actions. She had dropped out of school and returned home to her parents, but even there, the supernatural activity had followed her. Her family reported that their house had become plagued with the same phenomena Emma had experienced in her dorm: moving objects, unexplained voices, and most disturbing of all, Emma would sometimes speak as if she was someone else entirely, describing places she had never been and people she had never met with perfect accuracy. The pattern was unmistakable. Every person I had inhabited was either missing, institutionalized, or experiencing such intense supernatural activity that their lives had been completely destroyed. I wasn't just observing paranormal encounters, I was delivering something to these people, something that permanently altered their spiritual state and made them vulnerable to possession or worse. And the longer this went on, the more I realized that I was being changed by the process as well. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further, because by the 4th month, my own paranormal experiences had intensified to the point where I could barely function during my waking hours. My apartment had become a nexus of supernatural activity that seemed to be building towards something catastrophic. Electronics would turn on by themselves and display messages in that same unknown language I had seen in Frank's drawings. Mirrors throughout my home would show reflections that moved independently of my actions, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of the people I had inhabited standing behind me, their faces twisted with expressions of accusation and despair. But the most terrifying development was that I had started experiencing involuntary consciousness shifts during my waking hours. Without warning, I would suddenly find myself viewing the world through someone else's eyes for brief moments, even when it wasn't 3:33 a.m. These daytime episodes were different from my nightly experiences. Instead of inhabiting people who were already dealing with paranormal activity, I was being thrust into the bodies of ordinary people going about their daily lives. But the moment I arrived in their consciousness, supernatural phenomena would immediately manifest around them. I watched through a businessman's eyes as his office computer screen filled with images of deceased family members. I experienced a mother's terror as her toddler began speaking in the voice of an adult man, describing detailed memories of a life that had ended decades before the child was born. I felt a teenager's confusion as every mirror in his house suddenly showed his reflection, aged by 50 years, with hollow eyes and a mouth that moved to form words he wasn't speaking. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because these daytime transfers revealed something crucial about the entities behind my torment. They weren't just collecting spiritual energy from paranormally active individuals. They were expanding their operations, using me to identify and corrupt new targets. Each person I briefly inhabited during these daytime episodes would continue experiencing supernatural encounters long after I had left their consciousness. I was spreading whatever spiritual contamination I carried like a supernatural virus, and the infection rate was accelerating. The breakthrough came during my encounter with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a paranormal researcher at Stanford University, whose body I inhabited during one of these daytime episodes. Unlike my previous hosts, Dr. Hernandez had spent her career studying supernatural phenomena and recognized immediately what was happening when she felt my presence in her consciousness. Instead of panicking, she began conducting real-time experiments, asking me questions through her own thoughts and documenting my responses. Through our bizarre telepathic conversation, Dr. Hernandez helped me understand that I was dealing with entities she called consciousness parasites, supernatural beings that existed by feeding on human spiritual energy and reproducing by creating hybrid consciousnesses that could bridge the gap between their realm and ours. According to her research, these entities had been responsible for possession cases throughout history, but they had evolved their methods to become more sophisticated and harder to detect. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because what Dr. Hernandez told me next explained everything and made my situation infinitely more terrifying. The nightly body-swapping experiences weren't random. They were a grooming process. The entities were gradually conditioning me to exist outside my own body, preparing my consciousness for a permanent transfer that would allow one of them to take permanent residence in my physical form, while my soul would be trapped in their realm, experiencing eternal torment while providing them with a continuous source of spiritual energy. But the most horrifying revelation was that I was running out of time. Dr. Hernandez's research indicated that the conditioning process typically lasted 6 months before the final transfer occurred. I was already 4 months into the experience, which meant I had perhaps 8 weeks before whatever was orchestrating this supernatural nightmare would attempt to trap my consciousness permanently and steal my body for its own use. The signs were already manifesting. My reflection had begun showing subtle differences, expressions I wasn't making, movements that didn't match my own actions, and occasionally, brief glimpses of something else looking back at me through my own eyes. My voice had started changing pitch and tone without my conscious control, and I had begun speaking words and phrases in languages I didn't recognize. Most terrifying of all, I was starting to lose time during my normal waking hours, coming back to consciousness to find that I had been somewhere else or had done things I couldn't remember. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories, because Dr. Hernandez gave me one piece of hope along with all the horrible revelations. She believed there might be a way to break the connection and free myself from the entity's control, but it would require me to voluntarily enter their realm during one of my nightly transfers and confront whatever intelligence was orchestrating the entire operation. The risk was enormous. If I failed, I would be trapped forever, and my body would become a permanent vessel for something that would use it to harvest spiritual energy from thousands of additional victims. But if I succeeded, I might not only free myself, but also break the connection for all the people who had been contaminated through their contact with me. The decision I faced was impossible. Accept my fate and allow myself to be consumed by these entities, or risk everything in a desperate attempt to fight back against forces that operated beyond human understanding and had been perfecting their predatory methods for centuries. Paragraph 4, 2,000 words. The night I decided to fight back against the entities that had been torturing me for 5 months was October 31st, Halloween night, when the barrier between dimensions is traditionally believed to be at its thinnest. Dr. Hernandez had spent weeks preparing me through our telepathic communications during my involuntary visits to her consciousness, teaching me techniques for maintaining my sense of self while navigating supernatural realms, and providing me with mental tools that might help me resist the consciousness parasite's attempts to trap my soul permanently. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar, because what I discovered that night in the entity's realm revealed the true scope of their operation and the horrifying fate that awaited not just me, but potentially thousands of other people who had been marked for spiritual harvesting. When 3:33 a.m. arrived and I felt the familiar pulling sensation beginning to tear my consciousness from my body, instead of resisting as I had every night for months, I embraced it fully, allowing myself to be drawn deeper into the supernatural current than ever before. Instead of finding myself in another person's body, I was pulled into what can only be described as a vast, twisted reflection of our reality. I found myself standing in a nightmarish landscape that seemed to be composed of fragments from the lives of every person I had inhabited over the past 5 months. Sarah's motel room existed alongside Frank's haunted house. Emma's dorm room connected to Marcus's truck, and Rebecca's historic home in Savannah stood impossibly adjacent to dozens of other locations I recognized from my supernatural tours. But the most horrifying aspect of this realm wasn't the impossible geography, it was the inhabitants. Every person whose body I had visited was there, but they weren't really people anymore. They had been transformed into something between human and shadow, retaining their physical appearance but moving with the jerky, unnatural motions of marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer. Their eyes had been replaced with voids that seemed to absorb light, and when they spoke, multiple voices emerged from their mouths simultaneously, creating a cacophony of overlapping words and languages that hurt to listen to. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because these corrupted versions of my former hosts weren't just random supernatural prisoners, they were the consciousness parasite's army. Dr. Hernandez had theorized that the entities couldn't directly interact with our physical realm without human vessels, so they created hybrid beings by trapping human souls and merging them with their own alien consciousness. The result was creatures that retained human memories and emotional responses, but were controlled by an intelligence that viewed humanity as nothing more than a renewable resource to be harvested and consumed. Sarah's twisted form approached me first, her face cycling through expressions of rage, despair, and predatory hunger. When she spoke, her voice was layered with at least 6 different tones, creating words that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my mind. "You brought us to them," she said, her mouth moving independently of the sounds. "You delivered us like gift-wrapped presents to entities that had been hunting us for years. We trusted you, and you fed us to demons." The accusation hit me like a physical blow because I realized it was true. I hadn't been an unwilling victim. I had been an active participant in their spiritual destruction. Every night when I inhabited their bodies, I had been delivering them to creatures that had been patiently waiting for the right moment to claim them. My presence had been the final catalyst that allowed the consciousness parasites to break through whatever natural defenses these people had possessed. Frank's corrupted form materialized next to Sarah, his elderly face now bearing scars that seemed to move and shift like living tattoos. "The collector wasn't coming for me," he said, his voice echoing with the sound of grinding metal. "It was already inside me, waiting for you to open the door. You were the key that unlocked our spiritual prisons and handed us over to be devoured." Comment below what you think is really happening here, because as more of my former hosts surrounded me, I began to understand the true purpose of the consciousness parasite's operation. They weren't just randomly harvesting human souls. They were building something, Each person they converted became part of a larger collective consciousness that was preparing for what they called the convergence, an event that would allow them to break through into our reality permanently and begin harvesting human spiritual energy on a global scale. Emma's transformed form stepped forward, her young face now bearing the marks of supernatural torture that had lasted far longer than the few months since my visit to her consciousness. "We've been screaming your name every night since you delivered us here," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "We've been trying to warn you, trying to tell you what they're really planning, but you couldn't hear us because you were too busy playing victim instead of recognizing that you're the weapon they've been crafting." The realization struck me with devastating clarity. I hadn't been chosen randomly for this torment. I had been specifically selected and carefully groomed because I possessed some quality that made me an ideal conduit between realms. The consciousness parasites had been monitoring human populations for individuals with the right combination of spiritual sensitivity and psychological vulnerability, and I had apparently fit their requirements perfectly. Marcus appeared next, his truck driver's practical demeanor now twisted into something predatory and alien. "The routes I drove weren't random," he said, his voice accompanied by the sound of highway wind and diesel engines. "I was being guided to collect spiritual imprints from accident sites, locations where the barrier between realms had been weakened by sudden violent death. You absorbed all of that residual energy when you inhabited my body, and now you're carrying enough supernatural contamination to serve as an anchor point for their invasion. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because the true horror of my situation became clear as Rebecca joined the circle of my corrupted former hosts. Her maternal warmth had been replaced by something that radiated cold malevolence, but underneath the alien intelligence controlling her, I could still sense fragments of the terrified mother who had just been trying to protect her daughter from supernatural forces she didn't understand. "My house wasn't haunted by random spirits," Rebecca said, her voice layered with the laughter of children who had never lived. "It was a collection point where they gathered spiritual energy from families who had been systematically traumatized and prepared for harvesting. When you visited my consciousness, you absorbed centuries of accumulated supernatural contamination, making you powerful enough to serve as their primary vessel in our world. But the most terrifying revelation came when the corrupted forms of my former hosts began to step aside, revealing what had been orchestrating everything from the beginning. At the center of this nightmarish realm stood something that defied description, a writhing mass of shadows and stolen consciousness that seemed to be composed of thousands of human souls twisted together into a single malevolent intelligence. This was the entity that Dr. Hernandez had theorized about, the consciousness parasite that had been feeding on human spiritual energy for centuries and was now preparing for its final evolution. The entity spoke without words, communicating directly into my mind with a voice that sounded like every person I had ever inhabited speaking in unison. "You have served your purpose well," it said, its presence pressing against my consciousness like a weight that threatened to crush my sense of self. "We chose you because your spiritual signature resonated at exactly the frequency we needed to breach the barriers between realms. Every person you visited, every soul you delivered to us, has strengthened our ability to manifest in your physical reality. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because what happened next revealed the true scope of the consciousness parasite's plan for humanity. The entity showed me visions of what would happen if I allowed myself to be consumed. My body would become the anchor point for an invasion that would spread across the entire planet. The supernatural contamination I had been accumulating for 5 months would allow them to open permanent gateways between realms, and every human with even the slightest spiritual sensitivity would become vulnerable to possession. I watched in horror as the entity projected images of cities filled with people whose eyes had been replaced by voids, their bodies moving with the same jerky, unnatural motions I had seen in my corrupted former hosts. This was the convergence, a complete spiritual takeover of humanity that would transform our entire species into a renewable energy source for beings that existed beyond our understanding of reality. But Dr. Hernandez had prepared me for this moment. Using the mental techniques she had taught me, I began to resist the entity's attempts to overwhelm my consciousness and began fighting back with every fragment of willpower I could summon. The key, she had told me, was to refuse to accept the guilt and self-blame that the entity was using to weaken my spiritual defenses. I hadn't chosen to become their weapon. I had been manipulated and used by creatures that had been perfecting their predatory methods for millennia. Comment below what you think I should have done in this situation, because the battle that followed tested the very limits of human consciousness and spiritual endurance. Drawing on every memory of the people I had inhabited, not just their fear and despair, but their love, their courage, their determination to protect the people they cared about, I began to push back against the entity's attempts to consume my soul. The consciousness parasite had made one crucial mistake in its preparation process. By forcing me to experience the lives and emotions of dozens of different people, it had inadvertently given me access to a vast reservoir of human spiritual energy that I could draw upon in my moment of greatest need. Each person whose body I had inhabited had left traces of their strength, their will to survive, their refusal to surrender to the supernatural forces that threatened them. Sarah's stubborn determination to escape whatever was hunting her, Frank's decades of resistance against the entities that had haunted his home, Emma's fierce intelligence and refusal to accept easy explanations, Marcus's practical problem-solving mindset, and his ability to navigate dangerous situations, Rebecca's protective maternal instincts, and her willingness to fight for her daughter's safety. All of these qualities had become part of me through our shared consciousness experiences. Let me know if you want to hear what happened next, because using this collective spiritual energy, I launched a counterattack that the consciousness parasite had never anticipated. Instead of trying to escape or hide from its influence, I embraced the connection it had created between us and began flooding its consciousness with every positive human emotion and memory I had access to. Love, hope, compassion, creativity, humor, wonder, all the qualities that made human consciousness unique and valuable. The entity recoiled as if I had struck it with physical force. Its alien intelligence was designed to feed on fear, despair, and spiritual contamination, but it had no defense against the pure, undiluted essence of human joy and connection. The corrupted forms of my former hosts began to waver and flicker as the entity's control over them weakened, and for brief moments, I could see glimpses of their true selves struggling to break free from their supernatural prison. Paragraph 5, 2,000 words. The battle for my soul and the fate of every person the consciousness parasites had targeted reached its climax as the entity's realm began to collapse around us. The stolen fragments of human consciousness that it had been hoarding for centuries started breaking free, creating a spiritual feedback loop that threatened to tear apart the very foundation of its existence. But the entity had one final desperate gambit that would either complete its invasion of our reality or destroy both of us in the process. Hit the like button if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, because what happened in those final moments revealed truths about human consciousness and spiritual resilience that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of existence. As the entity's control over the corrupted souls began to weaken, it made a last-ditch attempt to force a permanent merger with my consciousness, trying to use the spiritual contamination I had accumulated as a bridge to anchor itself permanently in our physical realm. The sensation was indescribable, like having every thought, memory, and emotion I had ever experienced being stretched and twisted until they threatened to snap entirely. The entity was trying to hollow out my consciousness from the inside, creating enough space within my spiritual essence to house its own alien intelligence, while keeping me alive but powerless as a passenger in my own body. But the people whose lives I had shared weren't going to let that happen without a fight. As the entity pressed deeper into my consciousness, I felt Sarah's stubborn refusal to surrender, Frank's decades of experience resisting supernatural influence, Emma's analytical mind working to find weaknesses in the entity's attack, Marcus's practical determination to solve problems under pressure, and Rebecca's fierce protective instincts extending not just to her own daughter but to me as well. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because together, we found the entity's critical vulnerability. The consciousness parasite had become so focused on accumulating and controlling human spiritual energy that it had forgotten the most fundamental truth about consciousness itself. It cannot be truly possessed or controlled if it refuses to surrender. Every human soul it had captured over the centuries was still fighting back, still maintaining some fragment of their individual identity despite being trapped in its collective nightmare. Using this realization, I stopped trying to resist the entity's invasion and instead opened my consciousness completely, inviting not just the consciousness parasite, but every soul it had captured to merge with my awareness simultaneously. The entity thought it was finally achieving its goal of complete spiritual domination, but what actually happened was that hundreds of human consciousnesses suddenly had access to my connection to the physical realm. The result was catastrophic for the consciousness parasite. Instead of one human soul to control, it suddenly found itself trying to manage hundreds of individual consciousnesses that were all working together to overwhelm its alien intelligence with pure human experience. We flooded its awareness with memories of love, laughter, creativity, hope, and all the messy, wonderful complexity of human emotion that its predatory nature couldn't process or digest. Comment below if you've experienced anything similar, because what followed was like watching a computer virus destroy itself by trying to process too much information at once. The consciousness parasite began to fragment and dissolve as its alien intelligence was overwhelmed by the sheer diversity and intensity of human consciousness. Its carefully constructed realm of stolen souls collapsed, and I felt every person it had captured being pulled back toward their own bodies and their own lives. But the victory came at a cost that I'm still struggling to understand months later. When I finally returned to my own body at 4 a.m. on November 1st, I wasn't alone. Fragments of every consciousness I had encountered during my 5-month nightmare had come back with me, not as invasive presences, but as integrated aspects of my own spiritual identity. I could still access Sarah's memories, Frank's wisdom, Emma's intelligence, Marcus's practical skills, and Rebecca's protective instincts, but now they felt like natural parts of my own personality, rather than foreign intrusions. The nightly body-swapping episode stopped completely after that Halloween night confrontation, but the paranormal activity in my apartment intensified for several weeks as the spiritual contamination I had accumulated gradually dissipated. Electronics continued to malfunction, but instead of displaying threatening messages, they began showing images and words related to healing and recovery. Mirrors reflected my normal appearance, but occasionally I would catch glimpses of the people I had helped rescue, and they would nod or smile before fading away. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more about the aftermath, because the most unexpected consequence of my supernatural ordeal was that I discovered I had retained some ability to sense paranormal activity and help people who were dealing with supernatural encounters. Dr. Hernandez contacted me several weeks after the Halloween incident to tell me that she had felt the moment when the consciousness parasite's network collapsed, and that reports of possession and unexplained disappearances had dropped dramatically across the country. She theorized that by destroying the primary consciousness parasite, we had disrupted an entire supernatural ecosystem that had been operating for centuries. The entity I had confronted wasn't the only one of its kind, but it had been a central hub that coordinated the activities of smaller parasitic entities across North America. Without its guidance and power, the remaining consciousness parasites had become much less effective at identifying and targeting spiritually sensitive individuals. But Dr. Hernandez also warned me that the victory was likely temporary. Consciousness parasites exist outside our normal understanding of time and space, and there was a possibility that similar entities would eventually rebuild their networks and resume their spiritual harvesting operations. The experience had fundamentally changed me in ways that made me both more resistant to supernatural influence and more attractive as a target for entities that might want to study or replicate what I had accomplished. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories, because over the following months, I began receiving messages from people across the country who claimed to have experienced similar body-swapping episodes. Some had started before my own experiences and continued beyond the Halloween incident, suggesting that the consciousness parasites had been operating multiple harvesting networks simultaneously. Others had begun experiencing the phenomenon only after the primary entity's destruction, implying that its collapse had somehow freed or activated dormant supernatural forces that were now trying to fill the void it had left behind. The most disturbing contacts came from people who claimed to have been among my involuntary hosts during my 5-month nightmare. Sarah reached out through an encrypted email account, explaining that she had regained consciousness in a psychiatric facility with no memory of the months following my visit to her body, but with vivid dreams of our shared experience in the consciousness parasite's realm. Frank had been released from his psychiatric hold after his supernatural encounters mysteriously stopped, and he wanted to thank me for whatever I had done to free him from decades of spiritual torment. Emma had returned to college with no clear memory of dropping out, but with inexplicable knowledge of paranormal research and a burning desire to study consciousness and supernatural phenomena. Marcus continued driving truck routes but now served as an informal network coordinator for drivers who encountered unexplained phenomena on the highways. Rebecca had moved to a new house with her daughter, and both of them had developed what could only be described as supernatural early warning systems that helped them avoid locations with high levels of paranormal activity. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because these communications revealed that our shared experience in the consciousness parasite's realm had created permanent connections between all of us. We had become an informal support network for people dealing with supernatural encounters, sharing information about paranormal hotspots, warning each other about areas of high spiritual activity, and providing assistance to individuals who were experiencing the kind of targeted harassment that had once made us all vulnerable to consciousness parasite predation. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of my supernatural ordeal was the realization that consciousness itself is far more flexible and resilient than most people understand. The experience of inhabiting dozens of different bodies and minds had taught me that individual identity is both more fragile and more enduring than I had ever imagined. We are all connected at levels that transcend physical reality, and the boundaries between self and other are much more permeable than our everyday experience suggests. The consciousness parasites had tried to exploit these connections to harvest human spiritual energy, but they had underestimated the power of conscious cooperation and mutual support. When human consciousnesses work together instead of being isolated and manipulated, we become capable of resisting and even defeating supernatural forces that operate beyond our normal understanding of reality. As I finish sharing this story with you, it's been 8 months since my last involuntary body swapping experience, but I still wake up every night at 3:33 a.m. Now, instead of finding myself in someone else's body, I use that time to send out what I can only describe as spiritual protection to people who might be experiencing supernatural encounters. Whether this actually helps anyone, or is just a psychological coping mechanism, I may never know for certain. What I do know is that the human spirit is far more powerful and resilient than the entities that try to prey upon it. We are not helpless victims of supernatural forces. We are conscious beings capable of love, creativity, cooperation, and spiritual growth that no alien intelligence can truly understand or control. And sometimes, when we work together and refuse to surrender to fear and despair, we can accomplish things that reshape the very nature of reality itself. If you've experienced anything similar to what I've described, please know that you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not powerless. There are others who understand what you're going through, and together we're stronger than anything that might try to harm us. Remember to like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe for more supernatural content, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to realize they're not facing their supernatural nightmare alone. And if you start waking up at 3:33 a.m. every night, don't ignore it. Pay attention to what your consciousness is trying to tell you, because that might be the first sign that you're about to play a crucial role in protecting humanity from forces that most people never even realize exist. Stay safe, stay connected, and never underestimate the power of human consciousness when it refuses to surrender to fear.